Very glad to know you're still with us here on VSA. An IMF report published on Friday, May 5, has found that comprehensive reforms combined with the African Continental Free Trade Area, that is the AfCFTA implementation, could increase the mechanized trade flow between African countries by 53% and with the rest of the world by 15%, and as a result, raise the real per capita GDP of the major African country by more than 10%. It notes that the agreement presents its members with an opportunity to take advantage of expanding trade to lift growth and living standards across the entire continent. As of February 2023, 46 of the 54 signatories, that's about 85.2% of countries that are signatory, have ratified it. Trading under the agreement began on January 1, 2021. However, it seems no trade has as yet taken place under the AfCFTA regime. Our discussion today on the Square will look at the findings of the report and its implementation 2 years on. I was basically amazed to hear that after 2 years, we're still talking about getting people and countries to utilize, to get this agreement started. What are some of the hiccups? Why is it being difficult? And why is this report suggesting that there are areas where reforms are required? I have my guest, Trevor Hambai, a financial analyst, senior partner with Development Finance Associates Zambia, joining us. Thank you for giving us your time.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon.
Good afternoon. First off, I wasn't quite sure I read right that as of now, it seems no trade has that yet taken place under the AfCFTA regime. That's the Africa Free Trade Agreement. It's been 2 years. To your knowledge, is this true? If yes, why?
I would think that this is true. There are specific challenges, I think, that have not been addressed with the agreement that have been inherent on the African continent as to why this trade has not been able to pick up. The first one is always speaking to infrastructure, is that on the African continent we have limitations in terms of infrastructure. So the factors that drive trade are, firstly, you must have facilities around logistics, which is air transport, road transport, rail transport, and sea transport. And all these ones seem to have a challenge. So the air transport on the continent is disintegrated, that you need to travel sometimes to Europe to come back to an African country if you're coming from the other side. And this makes it very, very expensive to do trade. The second one is road network as well, is that the road network between countries is very slow. And this makes it very, very expensive to actually do trade. We do not have direct connections between the African countries. The fourth factor that comes into play is obviously in terms of the agreement, there are still issues around imbalance between two countries. For one country to accept free trade from the other one is that they need to have equivalent trade going the other way. Otherwise, they lost in revenue. And this has not been dealt with in the agreement.
The report suggests that the implementation will entail a large reduction in tariff and non-tariff trade barriers among African countries if we can maximize the potential gains from enhanced trade integration in Africa. That's one submission in that report. What's your view?
I totally agree that it will require a lot of concessions from different countries, because there's a loss in income when they actually implement the tariff barriers. In that, if you accept a lot of imports into the country without having to have taxes on it, you are losing as a country. And this can only be regained typically if you're exporting as much. A lot of the African countries are more dependent on imports rather than exports. And this puts a lot of disadvantage to them in having signed the agreement. This is going to be a very slow process to be able to get past this. You know that we have tried this in different forms, both in West Africa and Southern Africa. We had the PTA, the preferential trade area. We had another one, which is the SADC, and I think there's also another one on in West Africa, which have had all the same challenges in terms of having to implement. And this one also, the Africa Trade Agreement, is also going the same direction, in that it's going towards non-success because of the barriers that have not been dealt.
The IMF paper is, from what I saw, says it examined the prospects for African trade integration in a context of a changing world. I'm taking a direct quote from the document: amid climate change, risk of geopolitical fragmentation, technological progress, and Africa's progressive demographic boom. What I want to get from you is, what are these prospects that is being referenced?
There are a number of lessons that the African country must take that are important for us to be able to implement this because of the geopolitical positions that are happening. First, what you do see, because of the geopolitical position between Russia, the US, and China, you find that now China and Russia are working towards having to de-dollarize trade on the global space. This also means, but also on the African continent, that we must be thinking about how we are able to capitalize this, because we just do not want to move from one currency to another dominated currency by another country in the West. We need to be able to develop our capacity, firstly, to be able to increase production in the African continent, increase regional trade, and then we should be able to be speaking about creating a uniform currency to be able to use for trade on the continent. This will then give us a position that we do require going forward. Remember, is that in the next 5 to 10 years, Africa is going to be the fastest growing economy on the global space. Is that we need to be able to use it. And secondly, is that we've also got the fastest growing population in the world. And this is important in terms of having to maximize the potential that this creates. And this is why we want to be able to say on the African continent, we find solutions that speak to the African continent rather than the solutions that we've been looking at, which have probably been driven by the World Trade Organization, which really is speaking to the Western.
Okay, I'm getting some information from Nigeria that Ademola Adeleke has been affirmed as the rightful governor of Osun State. We'll be bringing you details of that story in a bit, but let's continue our conversation with our guest on the IMF report on the free trade agreement. This report is suggesting that there are some reforms that are required. We've talked about prospects. We've talked about the request for a review of tariff and the situation among countries. One other suggestion that they have is that beyond tariff is infrastructure, and you've already alluded to that. But how are they suggesting reform? That's something that, you know, as a layman, you will be wondering about when no deals has been signed off yet using the agreement. Wouldn't it be better to be talking about reforms from a layman's perspective when you've made an effort to try and implement it, and then you learn from the mistakes, and then you think about reforming the agreement? What would you say to someone who asks that kind of question?
So in terms of the reform, from my view, it is very simple to be able to implement the reform that are holistic, that addresses all the countries that are under the agreement. The initial one that we needed to be able to start with is bilateral agreements between countries to ensure that the issues around the tax barriers or the imbalance in the trade are addressed while we are developing the implementation of the Africa Free Trade Policy. So it is important, I think, in terms of the reform, for them to start from the bottom coming up, which is bilateral agreement between the countries. Once these agreements have come into place, a country will be able to sign agreements with, say, 4 or 5 countries within the region, and then these are the ones that come to the Africa Free Trade to be implemented, rather than having to think that you can bring holistic reform and then push it down to all the countries. And I think that is a very basic position that I think is workable at the moment.
Right. Regional trade integration could be an important element of a strategy for African countries to cope with rapid population growth, climate change, and emerging geopolitical fragmentation. That's another submission of that report. And I'm wondering, how will this agreement do that?
Sorry, ask the question again.
Okay. In that report, it talked about regional trade integration, and it says this agreement could be an important element in the strategy that African countries are coming up with to cope with, for instance, the population growth, climate change, and emerging fragmentation, geopolitical fragmentation. And my question to you is, how would this one document do all of this when we're talking about, tweaking it here and there, and it hasn't even started being used?
So I strongly feel that in terms of the approach, if we do take this approach of the Africa Free Trade Agreement, is that we will fail in terms of implementing this document. I strongly feel that we must start from the bottom, where the countries have just specific challenges they are looking at, whether it is climate change, whether it is tariffs, or whether it is imbalance in the volume of trade between the two countries, and sign an agreement between those two countries, which is a bilateral agreement. And any country can sign a number of agreements to be able to come then to the Africa Free Trade Facility, which is the AU, and say, this is what we have agreed between the countries, and yes, then we will be counter-signing on the Africa Free Trade Facility. Otherwise, it's going to be very, very difficult. I don't think we will achieve success in having to push these reforms down to other countries. Remember, the geopolitical positions of every country is different, even within the same region. There are some issues that comprehensively affect all the countries, but generally speaking, is that it must be a unique approach to every country that we are seeking to be able to increase their trade within the region.
How soon do you expect to hear of a trade deal that's been signed using the free trade agreement? It's been 2 years.
Are you breaking?
I'm asking from your vantage point, how soon do you expect to see some sort of trade deal orchestrated using the Africa Free Trade Agreement?
From my position, it's very unfortunate that we still have not signed any trade using the Africa Free Trade Agreement. There was a lot of hype around having this coming on board, and yes, it was delayed by the coverage, and came a year later, but you would have expected that countries would have prepared for this. And secondly, is that for any country that goes ahead and signs this agreement, is that they must be looking forward having to move to implementation, rather than just the purpose of signing an agreement for
Trevor, if you can hear me, we kind of lost you. Can you hear me? All right, I think we've lost him. The audio hasn't been so great. We sincerely apologize for that. And we hope we can have this conversation again in the future. So thank you very much to Trevor Hambai, financial analyst, senior partner with Development Finance Associates Zambia. All right, the breaking news right now is that Ademola Adeleke of the People's Democratic Party, PDP, in Nigeria's Osun State in the southwest of the country has been affirmed rightful winner of the state elections held just recently. This is the final verdict. It is coming from the Supreme Court of Nigeria, so no more litigation is expected going forward. And the governor, who was a dancing senator proposed, now is the governor of the state, and he can focus on getting the work done. Congratulations to Ademola Adeleke of the People's Democratic Party on being affirmed as the winner of the Osun State governorship election. So to wrap things up with my final thoughts, I can't help but speak on the situation in DR Congo, of what is being described as the worst ever flood that has so far taken over 400 lives in a country already ravaged by conflict. The people deserve all the help in the world. Please don't stay silent in the face of suffering. My heartfelt thank you to all the charities and volunteers risking their lives to provide the much-needed assistance. Thank you very much for watching the program today. Until next time, please keep safe. Bye for now.